Xenoblade Chronicles 3 has been released at long last, even earlier than what fans were initially told, and the game not only stays true to the standards that fans have come to expect with regards to the series, but also goes well above and beyond some of those expectations as well. Hey everyone, it's Grizzle, and welcome back to another Xenoblade Chronicles 3 video. In this video, I'm going to be giving out my first impressions for the game as I've been able to play for the last couple of days, and share with you all my first run as I am streaming it here on YouTube. All my past streams are immediately posted afterward onto the channel, so if you want to see any of my reactions to a specific cutscene, well, be my guest. Everyone's also more than welcome to join in, as I've been streaming the game most nights around 7 to 8 p.m. PST. Just please be mindful of spoilers, but other than that, join on in and just come say hi and chill. One last note, if you enjoy the content in this video or feel interested in my content in general, please feel free to share this video with your fellow Xenoblade enthusiasts, subscribe to my channel, and also follow me on Twitter, where I talk about many different games on an almost daily basis, link down below. All that being said, I have quite a few points to discuss, so let's get right into it. Now, just before we get into the nitty-gritty, I do want to say that as of writing the script for this video, I've completed chapter 3 of the game and am just about 40 hours into it. I'm playing this first run on hard mode, and by streaming the game as I've been, simple things like reading the text aloud for the audience naturally elongates the overall play time. That being said, as an avid fan of the series, I've just been soaking up absolutely every detail, listening to the full music of every theme, fighting every monster in sight, talking to every NPC, grabbing every little shiny on the floor, you know, the usual. So this video is not only going to have my first impressions of the story thus far, but also some of the points that I've been noticing and found very appreciative or a little bit even distasteful. To that end, while this is a first impressions video, I may bring up topics or discuss content that some may consider to be an early game spoiler, and I will do my absolute best to avoid as much of that as possible. Noting this, I will be using some footage from my streams that I will be using to show some of my points, but again, these will be as out of context as possible, and I will also leave my impressions of the story itself for the very end of this video, and I will have a sizable warning letting you all know in advance. So let's begin with what normally pops up at the start of every single game. I am talking about the tutorials. As with the start of most video games, there are a plethora of tutorials that will be presented to the player, from the mostly obvious ones like movement and controlling the camera, to every little minutia of combat. The Xenoblade Chronicles series is no exception, and I'm happy to say that overall, the tutorials in 3 are far better than they were in 2. Whereas in Xenoblade 2 some things weren't quite explained, they were misleading, or heck, they even gave the wrong or bad info at times, 3 not only hands out all of the information you need, but also at mostly appropriate intervals, including sometimes where they pertain to story-specific events such as class swapping. What's more, there are additional tutorial tips that can be accessed at any time in the menu, and even the ones you've already seen or been shown are also able to be reviewed again at any time. The drill battles are also a great way to visually and mechanically employ using many different aspects of combat as a near-perfect refresher. That said, on top of being extremely handholdy, there are a couple of downsides. Notably, there's been some tutorials that have just felt a bit obnoxious. I say this as a veteran of the series and perfectly understand that they're targeted at new players, but my point still stands. A really good point to talk about here as an example is when you get to your first shop in Colony 9, your squad leader is going to explain how to buy items and tell you about a really good one, and then the tutorial forces you to buy and equip an accessory that just raises max HP, even though if you were already going out of your way to get treasure chests on the way to that colony, you'd have come across a far better stat-stick accessory and would have naturally figured out how to equip it on your own. This essentially created a tutorial that was done over twice because one setting involved an item from the overworld and one was from the shop, but the function was still ultimately the same. It's not the only case of a tutorial essentially being done twice over either. When new mechanics are introduced later on, specifically when they involve the menu, the game forcibly stopped you from doing anything until you went to go practice for yourself. And if you wanted to change things back, you'd have to close the menu up entirely and reopen it again. The tutorial that to my knowledge upset a lot of players the most was at the start of chapter 2 when class swapping was introduced and the game forced you to swap every single character's class and make several successive menu changes for each of the 6 characters 3 times over, suggesting changes that, much like the accessory shop suggestion, promoted things that weren't really good calls to make. I remember giving healers tank skills that increase their aggro, for example. Yeah, sort of don't want to do that. But again, and I mean this sincerely, these gripes are very few and far between, and compared to the number of tutorials that are actually helpful in building up the player's competence to handle all of the mechanics in the game, especially as compared to the preceding titles, I think Xenoblade 3 has honestly the best tutorials in this series. I only wish that we had one telling us how running away is a valid tactic, because you'll be running away quite a lot if you've played in hard mode like I've been. So let's talk about the hard mode next and the combat next. When I first started the game, and even when I was discussing it in my earlier videos, I had mentioned that I'd be starting in hard mode because I felt confident both as a veteran and as someone who'd been analyzing all of the footage that we've gotten before the game's release. And then hard mode came along and absolutely stunned me with actual surprising difficulty. I expected at most some minor numerical changes, but I really did get treated to actual hard mode. Monsters and bosses have very high stats, and specific enemy types that encompass a lot of the story bosses all have very high break resistance. And that can really crunch and tax you as a player already having to deal with this enemy having a larger health pool, and you can't start your combos as reliably on those enemies. On top of that, chapter 1 is made even more difficult because you have only half the cast for that entire first chapter. The perfect example of this, and this is the one time I'll be bringing up a minor spoiler here, is the first major boss fight, because come on, we all know from the trailers that we've gotten that we'd be fighting Mr. Wildride first. This is the only fight where I had to actually lower the game difficulty, because not only with half the characters available to us and the increased stats, Mr. Wildride's enemy type also has that exceedingly high break resist. Now, to be fair, I could have beaten him on hard mode, but I would have had to have done the fight over and over again, potentially for hours, until I would have been blessed by a pull where I got to break topple him at least 5 or 6 times. What's more, a lot of enemies in the game have a huge variety of AoE or area of effect abilities that target multiple people, whether in a circular radius around whoever they're aggroing onto, or in a cone in front of them, or whatever. Paired with the amount of damage these hard mode enemies dole out, hard mode is more of a matter of just trying to stay alive rather than it is actually dealing damage. By the time I even beat chapter 3, I had to rely on many fights with at least half the cast consisting of healers. And then all this leads into yet another factor, which is aggro, simply who is generating enough threat to get the enemy's focus. Now, this is yet another factor that I really undervalued when I started Xenoblade 3. Typically in the past Xenoblade titles, the tanks may struggle slightly early on, but they usually end up holding pretty firm mob attention about a chapter or 2 in. Not the case at all this time. Aggro is incredibly fluid in this game. Not every tank ability is one that will generate aggro. In fact, when I took just one aggro generating ability off of Lands in the Wildride fight, I found out he couldn't at all maintain the attention to boss anymore because of the natural amount of aggro that came out of healing and dealing damage. In fact, both healing and the act of reviving fallen allies generate such high amounts of aggro that I've found myself in situations as hilariously awkward as this. Let's get that evasion up right away while all of our group is down. It was just evasion. It wasn't even healing. Now, everything I've said in the last while with regards to the difficulty in combat may sound negative, but in reality, I'm actually very satisfied and happy. Hard mode being actually difficult is surprising, but they made many of the fights much more rewarding. I enjoy that I have to be ready to approach a fight differently if I fail, and the game has that level of customization that will let me adjust accordingly. In fact, if I had to say anything about combat, especially against unique monsters and bosses, it's that the feel of combat heavily reminds me that I feel like I'm controlling an entire raid team in an MMORPG like in World of Warcraft or Final Fantasy XIV. To put a little bit of context there, raiding in an MMO requires not only a lot of coordination, but also in planning and preparation. As a group, decisions need to be made. Who are you going to bring in? How many do you want in each role? Is a third tank necessary for managing adds? Do you take an extra healer? Do you want more melee, or do you want more ranged in a specific fight? And many more of these kinds of questions. And with how Xenoblade Chronicles 3 is set up, it feels like I am my own raid team. I have my own squad of 6 characters that I can change at will to who I am controlling, and there's a 7th one controlled by the AI. When I'm not controlling a character, the AI in this game is actually very snappy and intuitive. For example, it won't often use the abilities that are part of combo chains until you or another AI uses the preceding part of that combo. Also, if a fight's not going well, I can call it, go to the character menus, and make so many meaningful choices in there that I could approach the same fight again in a completely different manner. I am so satisfied and interested to see if they'll shake it up more in the second half of the game. The other thing I can say about this game before I get into my impressions of the story itself relate to the NPCs and quest formatting of this game. NPCs are just a really fascinating case this time around in my opinion. So all of the NPCs in this game are wildly varied in terms of designs, and that plays to the strength of everyone being born from this sort of hodgepodge DNA blender. There's so many different and unique models. In fact, I've only had a handful of times where I've seen the generic NPC models being used in the same zone. I remember not feeling as immersed in some scenes of Xenoblade 2 as seriously as I should have been when I just saw 3 of the same adult male Gormati model in the background at one point, and I'm just glad to have seen nothing like that here. As for the uniquely named NPCs in 3, they're incredibly varied, they each have their own feelings, and many of them end up taking part in multiple different quest chains. More than that though, none of the NPCs I've come across have made me feel like I'm just clicking on a tutorial box like how many of the ones in Xenoblade 2 felt. All of 3's NPCs have something that invests into the world building of the game, they act like they're real people in the game, and they tend to talk about the states of their colonies or their own thoughts on the war. The quests themselves are easily the best I've seen from the series. Sure, each quest is going to have the exact same thing that you'll find in any other RPG, go kill a few enemies, bring back a few items, talk to a few other people, you know, but they all have very strong and compelling narratives relative to the plights of the characters that you come across. Many of these quests have unique small cutscenes, and don't even get me started on just how incredibly well done the hero stories are. I won't be showing or talking about any of them here, but man oh man are they just some of the best quests in the series so far, in my own personal opinion of course. And now we've reached the part where I'd like to talk about my impressions of the story so far. So if you'd like, I'll give you a few quick moments to close the video and just give you a big ol' thank you if you stuck with me this far. Now then, here's my thoughts on the story of Xenoblade Chronicles 3. First off, let me just say how happy I am to see a lot of my hopes and some of my own predictions even for the game already being met in the first part. I was absolutely gobsmacked at the levels of dark media and propaganda in this game that was used to highlight the heavy cost of the war between Kevis and Agnes and the toll it takes on the soldiers themselves. It literally took Noah to have a full-on epiphany during a fight that seemed to be going south for him to realize that something's wrong, and even trying to convince Mio wasn't working either. Even after the high-profile mission ended and both teams were rushing to Noah and Mio's sides, they still had their weapons drawn and they couldn't shake out that reflex. This is counterbalanced by a large amount of cutscenes of the group traveling and slowly but surely opening up to one another, and realizing that everything that they were taught their whole lives was nothing more than propaganda for the war. They also realize that they've taken part in the war and acknowledge that they've killed so many people. But they recognize that they really never had the option until they by chance were given the power of Ouroboros. It highlights how relatively mature much of the cast is, and seeing them grow alongside one another and banter and share in their grief and comfort has been extremely welcoming. I guess the other thing I am very happy to have seen is my prediction with the Chapter 2 boss ended up being actually correct, and that the console is going to be serving as the Zord of this game. The console's theatrical performance during the whole of the fight served to highlight just how little a threat they thought our party would be. We then destroyed the colony floor flame clock, and then it weakens him in a way that makes him defeatable, similar to how like Zord in Xenoblade 1 was only defeated after he was battered up by a river of pure ether, despite all of his banter and theatrics that our team was just so puny and insignificant. His death is ultimately the warning for the other consoles to take the group more seriously and elevate their responses. I found this a really cool minor parallel used to push the plot to the next step. Speaking of parallels, the themes and motifs that I've come across so far with relation to the first two games have also just been amazing to recognize. Mortha's somber tune playing in the daytime of Danag Desert, bits of Bionis Interior playing while we're in the Urian tunnels, and callbacks to items like Tasty Sausage and my personal favorite, the Fossil Monkey Fossil item, was amazing to see. It actually makes me sad that the majority of items don't have flavor text like there was in Xenoblade 1, but that's just a small issue that's totally otherwise fine. The heroes have all been also pretty amazing, Ethel and Yserd just being complete opposites of who I expected them to be personality-wise. Xeon just feeling like an even more stoic version of Link from Zelda Twilight Princess, and Teach honestly just having incredible opposing parallels to Amalthus from Xenoblade 2. In fact, I don't think I've come across a hero so far whose personality and story I've disliked. It feels incredible for me to say that because I've just enjoyed every single major character that's been introduced to me. Even the consoles with their theatrical performances have been pretty entertaining to have on screen, barring the fact that some of the lesser consoles just have very similar Mobius forms, which again is just one of my minor gripes that I'm otherwise content with. And that's really all of my bigger thoughts that I have on the game so far, but tell me, what are your own thoughts of the game? Let me know in the comments below, but please be mindful if you want to bring up potential spoilers. And again, I'll be continuing to stream my first run of Xenoblade Chronicles 3 most nights here on YouTube at around 7 to 8 p.m. PST. So if you just want to chill or see some of my reactions as we get into the later chapters, by all means please join me, I'd love to see you all there. Lastly, I just wanted to ask all of you guys what kind of content you would prefer to see from my channel in the future with regards to Xenoblade Chronicles 3. As a small-time YouTuber who's not making content as a profession, I don't feel that I could perhaps do super in-depth guides, for example, but if that's something you want to see, I am more than happy to give it a shot for you all. I plan to keep covering Xenoblade 3 more, so if you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing to my channel and sharing this video with all of your Xenoblade liking mutuals. Thank you very much for your time, and as always, have a great day.